Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be joining us from in the world, and indeed for some of us, a very early morning indeed. My name is Martins Paprinskis. I'm reader in public international law here at UCL, and tonight I am here in the rather modest but not entirely unimportant capacity of the host tonight as the co-editor of the Current Legal Problems and co-convener of the lecture series. And in that modest role, I have three things to say. First, to introduce you to the concept or remind you of the concept of current legal problems. Current Legal Problems is UCL's flagship lecture series existing since time immemorial for legal purposes in 1948, where we invite the star external speakers as well as our inaugural professorial colleagues to deliver lectures that are then published at the end of the year in an OUP published volume. So that is the concept of the series. The second point that I want to make is regarding today's order of proceedings. As you see on the screen, perhaps somewhat unusually, we have three participants. I am the host. In a minute, I will introduce the chair, who will introduce the speaker, who, as the name suggests, will speak for about 45 minutes. And after that, we will have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and answers. Let me make a technological observation regarding questions and answers. You will be able to enter them through the intuitively entitled Q&A box. That is something that you can enter at any point. You absolutely do not need to wait until the end of the proceedings. You have the option of entering the question anonymously or by entering your name. And if you enter your name, the chair during moderation will ask it. So that concludes my second point. Third point is the introduction of the chair, who for tonight is my wonderful colleague, Megan Donaldson, would be well known to all international lawyers, has published widely on public international law. I think that many of you would have read her decorated article on secret treaties in American Journal of International Law, the topic that she's pursuing in a forthcoming monograph with Oxford University Press, and recently was a co-editor with Drayton of a CUP book on history, politics, and law, thinking through the state, thinking through the international. I think fantastic book, a fantastic title. Incidentally, reminded me a great praise by the late and much missed James Crawford, who always objected to any title that was rethinking because he was uncertain that there was ever any thinking done about international law. That was the last point that you'll hear from me tonight. Megan, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Martins. It gives me real pleasure to welcome Sundhya Pahuja here tonight for the lecture, Empire Comes Home, 3 Phases in the Struggle to Decolonize International Law. Sundhya is Australian Research Council Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Professor and Director of the Institute for International Law and the Humanities at the Melbourne Law School. She's known for her work on the encounter between plural forms of international law, the legal, historical, political, and economic dimensions of the relations between Global South and North, and for her work on research methods and supervisory practice in international law. Sundhya is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences and in 2021 was awarded the Max Planck Cambridge Prize in International Law. She's been the Lauter Park Lecturer at Cambridge, the Newman Lecturer at Yale, the Genest Lecturer at Osgoode Hall, and the Douglas McKay Brown Lecturer at University of British Columbia. She's been twice a fellow at Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies in South Africa and a visiting professor at the National University of Singapore and the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Her current projects include an interdisciplinary project on populism and international law. That's with Richard Joyce, James Martell, Andrew Benjamin, and Rose Parfitt. Cold War Histories of International Law with Gary Simpson and Matthew Craven, and her laureate program on global corporations and international law. Sundhya is the author of the prize-winning book, Decolonizing International Law, Development, Economic Growth, and the Politics of Universality. That's Cambridge 2011. Her other books include the Routledge Handbook of International Law and the Humanities, 2021, edited with Shane Chalmers, International Law and the Cold War, 2019 volume, edited with Gary Simpson and Matthew Craven, and the Oxford Handbook on International Law and Development, which is forthcoming, edited with Louis Eslava and Ruth Buchanan. Sundhya has served as the Director of Studies in Public International Law at the Kaye Academy of International Law and as an advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. Sundhya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Megan. Okay, so thank you very much, Martins, for the invitation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to their elders and also to other Indigenous peoples from different places who might be in this virtual audience. Thank you very much, Megan, for that generous introduction and for commenting. I know it's a difficult time for people working in UK universities, and I give you my solidarity. We've gone through lots of industrial action last year, so I know how stressful it is. And I am sorry that I can't be there in person and see all of the people who are there, because I had a look at the names and there's a lot of familiar names, and so I really regret not being able to even see your faces, let alone see you in person in this webinar format. But in any case, I'm looking forward to talking to you this morning for me, or this evening for you. So when I received this invitation to give a lecture in this series and to write the accompanying article, I decided to take the opportunity to reflect upon a series of invitations that I've received lately to give lectures on some aspect of decolonising international law, or to speak about quote unquote colonial legacies. Each of these invitations is kind of interesting in its own way. And the article that I'm writing to accompany this lecture, I described these invitations more fully. But for the purposes of getting us going this evening, I just share three conclusions that I draw from that reflection. The first is that there's a strong generational shift taking place within the discipline of international law, which demands that we all think seriously about the legacies of empire, not just those people from the global south. The second is that in that shift, people seem to be grappling very much with the intertwined nature of the environmental, racial, economic, and political dimensions of the problems facing the world today. And the third is that amongst the new generations of students and scholars of international law, it seems that there is an increased awareness of the knowledge, or an awareness that knowledge production and disciplinary knowledge production are at the heart of the imperial inheritance. Interestingly, these recent invitations have mostly been coming from the global north and South Africa, which is its own kind of example, and coinciding with a proliferation of interest in universities in the north in decolonising practices at universities. This is interesting not because people from the global north are leading the charge, but because we in the north have come late to the party. Scholars and international lawyers and Indigenous jurists have been talking about such things for ages. And so it set me to thinking about why there is now a surge of interest in empire in the metropolitan heartlands, if I can call them that, and what we could make from the form that this has taken. And my sense in this interest, and this is entirely speculative, I have to say, rather than a deep causal argument, but my sense is that empire has come home. And I'm borrowing this phrase not from those who write about migration and diaspora, but from the historian Richard Drayton, who used it to describe what he calls corruption of democracy, which happened as a result of the war on terror. But I think that we can extend this idea further to the way that techniques of governance more broadly, which were honed in the colonies and in the global south after formal decolonisation, are now at large in the global north. A prominent example of this is investor-state dispute settlement and international investment law more broadly, And as Kerry Riddick has pithily put it, we are all developing countries now in that regard. But we can extend the metaphor too, I think, to notice that empire has come home in its consequences. So the environmental consequences of particular modes of extraction and consumption and waste generation and of relating to the earth, or in the consequences of racial hierarchies. So to elaborate on Drayton's phrase, empire has come home in the structures of governance and ways of knowing and ways of relating, and in what we understand the world that we are making to be. And as it comes home, it tends to meet the discourse of the virtuous West, which tries to transform radical calls for decolonisation into less radical things like diversity and inclusion, or to meet the challenge to imperial techniques of governance like investor-state dispute settlement through a turn to proceduralisation. But in that homecoming, what's also happening is that the imperative to decolonise is being reshaped in politically productive ways, as solidarity with a distant struggle coalesces with struggles inside the global north, and as international struggles and Indigenous struggles come together around a renewed understanding that the nation state is empire writ small in some senses, to borrow Peter Fitzpatrick's phrase. So all of that is perhaps a rather long introduction to explain why today, and in the article that I've written or that I'm writing, I thought it would be useful to survey the desire or the project to decolonise international law in recent historical context. And in the written version, I try to draw out the heads of the multi-headed hydra of racial hierarchy, of distributional inequality and environmental harm. But in this talk, I'll just stick with the environmental strand of the question so I don't run out of time even more than I undoubtedly will. And what I'm going to do today is tell a story which will schematise the urge to decolonise international law in the post-war period into 3 phases. So I'll schematise it, and I'll say something about how the environment figures in each phase. And I'll draw out the strategies and theoretical orientations of each phase to start to develop a repertoire of strategies that might help us to engage better with the imperial legacies of international law and the multi-headed hydra of today's crises, if you like. So let me take a sip of tea. It's still only 5 a.m. for me. So where should this story begin? Well, it used to be the norm that imperialism was never mentioned in the contemporary study of international law. A quick survey of the leading textbooks from and curricula from international legal courses between about the 1960s and the late 1990s, early 2000s will reveal this absence in those textbooks. But whether we are international lawyers located in the academy or elsewhere, it's no longer possible to be unaware of the historical relationship between imperialism and international law. A growing library of work in international law and related fields has shown us the ways that historically international legal doctrines justified imperialism and facilitated land appropriation and resource extraction, that international law as a profession emerged from an imperial imperative to civilize the non-European world, that theories of international law were written to claim the title of law, properly so called, for imperial international law, and to downgrade other forms of law to custom and tradition, that key institutions emerged from imperial imperatives, that key regimes of international law emerged to protect imperial assets, that structures of international law facilitated the expansion of imperial capitalism, that racialized hierarchies underpinned international hierarchies, that modern law was at the heart of the colonial project, and perhaps most profoundly for the field that the key concepts and legal forms of international law were forged in the unequal encounter between European and non-European polities. And new works are emerging every day which interrogate the historical relationship between international law and imperialism, which reveal the extent of this mutual imbrication. This slide is an unrepresentative sample of books. There are many more articles and chapters, and there will be more references in the article that will accompany this lecture. But whether in teaching, research, writing, or practice, we can no longer have a plausible account of international law that leaves imperialism out of its history. But a more contentious question is the relevance of that history for international law today. So for some people, that past represents a golden age. These aren't generally international lawyers, I have to say, but that past represents a moment of order and greatness to which the world must return, whether that's driven by nostalgia and the will to glory, or by the pragmatism about the irredeemably primitive native. For other people, that past is not glorious. It may be a source of shame rather than pride, but it is located in the past. So imperialism wasn't good, but it is over and history has moved on. This view can take different forms and rest on different periodizations. So different people locate the end of empire and the inauguration of a new beginning at different points. But for this group, at some point in the last 75 years, the world was born anew. From within the discipline of international law, for some people, this moment of the end of an imperial international law came with the establishment of the contemporary institutions of international law in the 1940s. Accounts like this narrate this moment as a moment of the universalization of international law and the inauguration of a new world order. Usually in the Euro-American Academy, this universalization is said to have happened in about 1944 with the establishment of the United Nations. And just one example of this is the Oxford Handbook of International Law, which explicitly stops in 1945 on the basis that the founding of the United Nations marks a caesura, not only in Western, but in world history. Others in this camp might argue that international law and imperialism instead parted ways during the 1960s and 70s, when most African states gained formal independence and changed the composition of the United Nations in profound ways. People in this subgrouping are more likely to be attentive to the fact that most of the world was still colonized in the 1940s when the architecture of the international institutions we have today was established. And they may also be attentive to the fact that the United Nations Charter did not outlaw colonization. But they are also attentive to the struggle for independence and feel that the acquisition of sovereignty by the colonized world produced a decisive break in the intimacies between international law and imperialism. So for this group, whether you think the break point was 1945 or 1975, imperialism is in the past. And perhaps ironically, I think this is where many versions of the incomplete decolonization arguments fit in that run, for instance, as the doctrinal basis of something like the Chagos case. But for this group, the diagnosis of the troubles of today's world would be something like the failure or betrayal of the liberal promise of contemporary international law. In this story, to paraphrase Gary Simpson, international law may be weak because of its lack of enforcement mechanisms, but it is virtuous. And based on this diagnosis, the task for international lawyers today and in the future is to extend the reach of international law, to ensure its enforcement, and to revive and make good its promise. But for others, this idea of a caesura is not persuasive. The break between past and present isn't clean, and imperialism did not end with formal decolonization. Instead, the relationship between international law and imperialism continues into the present. For these scholars and activists, it's not a coincidence that the maps repeat, as it were. And in particular, the geography of inequality and the geography of empire are strongly coincidental. For these scholars, the repetition is not a natural pattern, but a patterning, which international law is involved in repeating. So for this group, international law is not, quote, weak but virtuous, but it is powerful because of its constitutive or world-making function. And it's not clear that injustice is best tackled by the extension and enforcement of international law. At its most sober, when scholars who work in this vein look out the window and see the racist, undemocratic, sectarian international order that seems to be emerging from the ruins of liberal internationalism, they don't see a betrayal of the post-war international compact. Instead, they see the playing out of its contradictions and an ongoing or consistent refusal to deal with the legacies of empire. Not everyone in this rough grouping thinks the same way, but it's here with the many different kinds of activists and scholars in this loose group that I would locate the urge to decolonize international law. Not necessarily as a banner or slogan. Some of the most powerful work in this vein never uses the phrase decolonize international law at all, but as a sense that the relationship between imperialism and international law did not end with formal decolonization, but continues into the present. For this group, the legacies of empire are problematic for most of the world, but also highly beneficial to some. And the struggle to reckon with them is ongoing. So this group understands that this differential legacy is what makes the project of decolonization not simply a task of intellectual revelation, but a political battlefield. And they share the conviction that if we want to assert a wedge into the unequal distribution of suffering and pleasure in the world and international law's role in that distribution, then we must practice international law differently. And by practice here, I include practices of research and teaching and writing, as well as advocacy and litigation and reform. But although we're seeing this as a newish phenomenon in some disciplinary enclaves, this is not a novel realization. Post-independence leaders in the South were well aware of the relationship between imperial forms of European international law and imperial projects, and of the desire of imperial powers to continue those projects and to reap their advantages after formal independence. And this includes Latin American leaders in the 19th century, as well as African and Asian leaders in the 20th. But even if we stick with the last 80 years or so, most of the big battles over international law and institutions in the middle of the 20th century and before were precisely battles between those who wished to end the practices and patterns of empire and those who wished to retain them. This struggle to drive a wedge between imperialism and international law in the name of a new international law is what we could call decolonizing international law, phase 1. So in this phase, third world leaders sought to use the new international institutions to assert a new international law and to assert their authority through the newly acquired vehicle of sovereignty, and to mobilize that international law to redress colonial injustices and to build a new world. The examples of this are manifold. They include the struggle to challenge the Eurocentric racialized bias of the international order, for example, at the Bandung Conference, the first conference of African and Asian peoples held in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. They include the battle during the 1950s and 60s to use the UN to help those who had not yet decolonized through an assertion that imperialism was illegal in the UN General Assembly. It includes the assertion of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, which sought to take control over the natural resources sold to foreign companies under unfavourable colonial era concession agreements. It included the struggle to redesign the international trading order away from the unfair terms of trade through convening the UNCTAD in 1964. It includes the struggle to regulate transnational corporations and break the continuity with colonial companies through the establishment of the UNCTC, the UN Commission on Transnational Corporations, in 1975. It includes the struggle to amend the laws of war through the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, to extend the laws of war to anti-colonial struggle, particularly after the French insistence that the Algerian War was an internal matter and that independence fighters were not combatants but criminals under French law. And there are many more domains. There are many more of these struggles in domains from the law of the sea to development finance. And ironically, in institutional terms, the Cold War facilitated this, because in that internecine battle between the rival hegemons, that battle of competition and accommodation, a certain plurality was permitted that becomes less possible in a more unipolar world. And the circumstances explain the strategy. So independence took the form of statehood because it was the only way to enter the world, because there was a monopoly over legal personality claimed and protected in the nation state, claimed and protected for it by European international law. So the strategy was to use that hard-won prize of sovereignty to assert authority, to use the numbers in the General Assembly to pass resolutions, mobilise public opinion, and use solidarity to craft an international law capable of helping the third world. The way this was to be done was to insert a wedge into the global political economy of empire and to assert sovereign authority, which was held up as a capacity to decide. The tactics were immensely rule-based. Jurisprudentially, the strategies were implicitly positivistic because of an acceptance of state form and its laws. And in fact, this was criticised too at the time by many non-international lawyers who already saw the nation state form as empire writ small. But that's a different branch of the story. But I'd recommend a wonderful chapter here by Christopher Gevers comparing the approach of literary scholars and international legal scholars in the approach to the question of decolonisation. But in theoretical terms, one line of argumentation can be traced through those third world jurists who attempted to demonstrate that some of the fundamental principles of international law relating, for example, to treaties or to equity were also to be found in African or Eastern systems of thinking and statecraft, and indeed that they originated not in the West, but in the colonial world itself. And we can call these guys, if you like, following Gevers, the contributionists. Others were more syncretic, arguing that international law as it was posited by Europe was not the only version of international law which governed diplomatic relations, and that there were other versions. But both contributionists and syncretists argued that classical positivist international law was the product of imperialism, shaped to further the interests of the colonizer. And accordingly, they argued for the rejection or exclusion of particularly imperial rules, such as those regarding the nationalisation of foreign-owned property. And both of these strands do continue today. Usually, in contrast to the histories that we sometimes hear, in this period, it was the third world asserting the importance of international law as a rules-based international order, and the so-called first world ignoring it. And again, there are many examples of this. Rhetorically too, the third world always asserted the importance of history, remembering imperialism at their backs. Remember, remember, remember. We could summarize the strategy of decolonising international law phase one then as resisting, as remembering or enacting a form of historiographical diplomacy, and reimagining, and selectively taking up and reinterpreting international law. So the West responded to this in a hostile manner, and this hostility took shape in a number of ways. One of the responses was consistently to move decisions back to organs which were controlled by the West. So from UNCTAD to GATT, from the Special UN Fund on Economic Development to the IDA, the the kind of consolidation of decision making in the Bretton Woods institutions as opposed to the political institutions. There's a refusal to give legal weight to UN General Assembly resolutions through reassertions of the centrality of the doctrine of sources. There's a strategy of lending money to rulers willing to take it and to extend developmentalism through that. There's a strategy of asserting third world struggles as proxies for something else, to paint the third world as Soviet stooges and use that justification, often with fabricated intelligence, to, or sometimes just a hubristic sense of right, to justify various forms of intervention and to bring about regime change through military intervention, destabilization or CIA intervention, particularly in response to resource nationalizations. But rhetorically, the West was always inaugurating the world anew and doubting or casting doubt on the relevance of history. So in terms of the environment, there are two things to notice here. I should have labelled these pictures, but I can tell you what they are afterwards. So it's sometimes said that a concern for the environment simply didn't feature because the third world simply took up the model of industrial development, whether in its capitalist or socialist version. And although that's true to some extent, it's also true that what Beuys has called environmental Orientalism was shaping environmental policies. So Beuys was drawing on Said's idea of environmental Orientalism. On Said's idea of Orientalism to put forth a notion of environmental Orientalism, which is a name that he gives to the discourse which links racialized conceptions of people to their environmental practices. So what this means is that just as the birth of development and developmentalist thinking was replacing and reshaping the civilizing mission and training the third world to think of itself as lacking and in need of modernization, underpinned by Western knowledge in the new vernacular of development, so was this developmental knowledge co-constitutive of environmental Orientalism, in which developmental practice, knowledge, and funding was encouraging many in the third world to regard self-sufficiency or non-resource intensive practices or traditional practices of water management, etc., to regard these as non-modern or backward. And we can look at the work of Timothy Mitchell in the Middle East to track this with track the way this had very particular effects. So this discursive practice was embedded in practices of political economy, in which low intensity resource uses or practices and principles of self-sufficiency were disfavored by the West, who supported their own industries, including knowledge industries and research foundations, by providing aid tied to industrialization of agriculture, for example, and the purchase of inputs from the West, like fertilizer and seeds and consultants and experts. Again, there are many examples of this. One that comes to mind is Adil Hassan Khan's work on the Green Revolution in India, but we can find examples, like I mentioned, Mitchell in the Middle East, but also Diana Davis in North Africa, and so on. This environmental Orientalism was highly racialized and worked both ways, not only to discredit environmentally adapted behaviors as non-modern, but also encouraged international bodies and donor states and post-colonial states themselves to politically privilege subjects who behaved as ecological moderns in sites of profound post-colonial contestation and which were ecologically fragile. And Australia, white settlers in Australia, is a really good example of that. But this first phase of the project to decolonize international law was soon to be over. And as the Cold War ended, a debt crisis was engulfing the third world, particularly in Latin America, where structural adjustment was doing the work that diplomacy couldn't, to make sure that the new international economic order couldn't be brought into being. The former communist bloc was being dismantled and countries were shocked into capitalism. through IMF conditionality agreements. And in Washington, DC, a new world order was announced by George Bush Sr. And in Western countries, including Australia, where I studied international law after the end of the Cold War, I'd like it to be noted, a liberal international order was being hailed as emergent after its abeyance during the Cold War period. And it's interesting to reflect on one's own training in international law and how the moment inflects the way that we're taught. But this brought with it, in the mainstream of international law, an orgy of forgetting. So this inauguration of the new order was a mythologized account of the triumphant return of a liberal international order that never was. And in this mythologized account, all of the third world initiatives I've just described, which you can see were highly legalized strategies, were relegated to the realm of politics, not law. So in that story, those battles were lost and the failures were ontologized or narrated as having always been inevitable. But in a different version of the story, it's more accurate to say that the third world was defeated and that the battle itself was almost instantly redescribed from the perspective of the victor. It was at this point too that the idea of third world went from being an asserted third way or political and juridical and political project to a position in a hierarchy with the second world knocked out. But it's in this combination of a defeat and the durability, to borrow Stoller's phrase, of imperial patterns of relation, that the new decolonizing sensibility emerged. And we could call this decolonizing international law phase 2. This time, scholars and activists from the South and their friends and allies were trying not only to continue the struggle to make law and institutions work better for the third world, or global South, as it was now beginning to be called, but also trying to account for how to make sense of what seemed like an utter failure of all the attempts to transform the international institutions and international law in the direction of greater justice after empire. This generation of scholars also sought to learn from that failure without discrediting those who had waged the earlier struggles or discounting their courage with a sort of cheap wisdom of hindsight, if you like. What these circumstances produced then was a methodological turn. In other words, it wasn't just a question of waging a struggle, but it was a question of trying to understand how so many attempts by the third world to use international law had not succeeded, that scholars in particular started to turn in toward the discipline to figure out if there was something particular about the structure, legal forms, and disciplinary routines which was generating these outcomes. So a good example of this and the account is Tony Youngie's famous Sovereignty, Imperialism and the Making of International Law, published now in 2005. And those of you who've read that book will know that the image I'm showing is a picture of Nauru, because the impelling concern of Youngie's book is a story about his own involvement in the Nauru Commission and the phosphate mining by Australia in large measure, which showed to him that international law facilitated imperial exploitation and prevented redress. So he came to that with a faith in international law, and through his work with Veeramanthri on the Nauru Commission, found that there was no relief to be obtained there. And through this account, he took the methodological turn and came up with his understanding of the sovereignty concept as forged in this dynamic of difference, as he famously put it. Others took similar methodological turns, whether explicitly linking it to the first phase of decolonizing international law or not. Their technique was to look for the carriers of continuity, whether as practice or technique, or as concepts and structures, or as legal forms. And the more people looked for the continuities with empire, the more they found. And the more profoundly the structural complicity seemed to manifest itself. So we can go down in layers to the bedrock, looking for continuities with imperialism in the persistence of race, in the continuities of technologies of rule through, for example, Gathi's account of good governance or debt conditionality, or the critique of universality, or Chimney's structure of economy, or Jennifer Beard's account of the continuity of the confessional structure of Christianity through those phases of international law, or Anne Orford's account of the discourses of intervention, or Fitzpatrick's account of the mythology of modern law, or Guterres's account of the critique of progress. The jurisprudential and theoretical methods also shifted in line with this unearthing. So now there's a move away from the positivism of decolonising international law, phase 1, and from the theoretical moves of, contributionism and syncretism. Instead, we now see different strategies, including the famous critique of law's indeterminacy that we might find in Koskiniemi's politics Koskiniemi's Apology to Utopia. So that challenges the idea that international law is neutral and objective, and notices that every decision is a decision about value. Or we could think of the way that a lot of this work was about the revelation of structural bias. And there's an attention here to the constitutive function of international law in terms of world making. So international law is not powerful in the way that was imagined and disappointed in phase 1. It's not powerful because of its normative function, but it is very powerful for a very different reason. And that's because of its constitutive or creative function. And we can think here of the work of people like David Kennedy or Fleur Johns. But there's 3 big recurrent themes across much of this work. So historicization. So instead of remembering, we historicize. We can't forget the historical context in which the legal forms and doctrines of international law emerged. Instead of reforming, we deconstruct and critique representation. So we cannot forget the Orientalist underpinnings of Enlightenment thought. And instead of arguing about contributionism, which is basically an argument that we are universal too, the strategy is to provincialize, which is to say you are not universal. In other words, to say that the universal was always a claim for the universality of a European particular and the particularization of the other. So in this methodological revolution, the place of the environment is interesting. So my story is a little bit complicated here because I'm going to tell you 2 things that don't belong, although people think they might, or people might think that they might. So one story is that during this time, international environmental law was being consolidated as a regime, extending from principles of transboundary harm, and that there was little interest, there was little third world interest in the emergence and expansion of this technical field. And many had said at this time that the third world was hostile to international environmental law. And this played out in a battle given a familiar jurisdictional cast between the good internationalist environmental lawyers and the bad nationalist third world international lawyers. Instead, the influence of the South is said to have been felt in doctrines or ideas like common but differentiated responsibility, which recognise a different responsibility for who caused harm and who should bear responsibility for fixing the problem. And in discourses like sustainable development, because the third world needed first to catch up and worry about the environment second. But although these doctrinal discourses were circulating at the same time as this phase of decolonisation I'm describing, and although many of these 2 ideas came from the mouths of many third world states, they do not belong in the category of decolonising international law phase 2. Because although they do recognise the unequal distribution of wealth, they accept the development paradigm in which development is a proxy for well-being, that the North is somehow further along and not only more responsible, but also more capable of taking responsibility, as well as accepting a growth paradigm, even if it must be tempered. So the institutionalized discourse of sustainable development is particularly problematic in this regard. So this is goal 8 of the SDGs. So this purports to both recognise the Earth limits and still enshrines not just growth, but a percentage target. So if these discourses don't belong as the environmental aspects of decolonising international law phase 2, what does? So in this second phase of decolonising international law, those who, I would argue, engage with the substance of imperial continuities, pursue a project of decolonising international law, as well as being attentive to the Earth's limits at the same time. You don't have to read the abstract here. I'm putting it up as an example, which I'll get to in a second, but their work tends to pay attention to the constitutive or creative function of law rather than technical doctrines of remediation, and to adopt an historicised account which assesses the question of environmental damage and its relationship to international law in historical context. So again, note the methodological dimensions of that continuity. So for these scholars and activists, what this approach enables us to see is the way that crafting legal solutions to environmental problems tends only to be ameliorative. And we could make the same argument about human rights to some extent, but that's probably a controversy I don't have time to get into now. But they also distract us from the harmful practices of international law, which produce the unsustainable behaviours in the first place and which are not considered to be niche environmental areas. So instead, these approaches pursue the intuition that particular understandings of nature and the natural environment lie at the heart of key disciplinary concepts such as sovereignty, economy, property, and humanity. And a very good example of this is the ongoing Locating Nature project of Usha Natarajan and Julia Dem and others, who argue that international environmental law itself is implicated in the understandings of nature and the environment in ways which obfuscate and normalise sources of environmental harm and hinder us from imagining effective solutions. So there are many layers to this, but I hope that you're getting the sense of the way that there's an enfolded kind of methodological turn in this as well. So the point is, in this approach, rather than focusing on remediation, it's better to focus on permissive activities, which we could think of as regimes of environmental harm, like consumption-based growth or trade regimes, or the enclosure of the commons through IP law, or practices of extraction. Or in a slightly different vein, before one thinks about making and enforcing the rules about transboundary harm, think about the structures and legal forms of this law, state law, European imperial international law, and how it backgrounds the activity that you seek to regulate in the first place. So international law backgrounds the way that we share the earth as land appropriation, the way that we share the earth in its conceptual transformation of nature or the more than human into some kinds of knowledge and into institutionalized resources. And again, more examples of this are given in the written paper. But the other thing, I'm moving toward the end, don't worry, I won't spend as long on it, the next phase, because it's much more emergent. The other thing that emerges from this period is the changing scope of the study of what happened to these third world initiatives. And as I've already said, the post-Cold War triumphalism of Western states naturalised their failure and relegated them to the political as we know. And ironically, some of the structural critiques of decolonising international law phase 1 enhanced the tendency to think of their failure as inevitable. So some of the critiques coming from the global south, though this time that inevitability could be attributed to capitalism rather than primordialism. But still, there's an unintended consequence of naturalising the failure of those initiatives. But as the archives began to open after the Cold War 30-year rule in many countries, here's a picture of lots of national archives, and because of the insistence on history, more scholars start to try to understand the assertion and failure of the first waves of attempts to decolonize international law. And you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see that those initiatives didn't die, they were killed. And the discovery or confirmation of the intentional practices of counter-revolution, if you like, and the racialized foundations of many of those practices is meticulously documented by international legal scholars and adjacent scholars like Joey Slaughter and Adom Getachew, Philip Moravsky, Quinn Slobody and Hajun Chang, Vijay Prashad, Dina Tsuvala. And what they show us is that there's a durability of imperial forms of relation, and that the postmortem reveals that the cause of death of those initiatives was counter-revolution, not natural death. So there's a corpse, there's a bloodied corpse on the floor. So this work that I've been describing is a sort of overlapping category between phases 1 and phases 2, or between phases 2 and phases 3 of the project to decolonize international law, and it continues. But there has also been a shift, another shift to what I would call decolonizing international law, phase 3. And I'm not describing here everything that goes under the name of decolonizing in the present day. Rather, I'm describing the version of this approach that I think is most helpful in thinking through that intertwining of elements with which I began, the environmental, the racial, the distributional, and so on. And in this shift, instead of describing a strategy with an environmental dimension, I think the environmental dimension and possibly the others are front and center rather than add-ons. This is because the third world or the global south finds itself at the conjunction of several contradictory features of the practices of world ordering. Those features include environmental Orientalism, which racializes and discredits light tread environmental practices, developmental models predicated on growth, the articulation of states within a global economy structured around global value chains, which both outsource and outsync, if you like, facilitated by international law, an inherited state form that's built essentially on property and resource extraction, and circumstances of increasing environmental difficulty in which risk might be shared, but vulnerability is unevenly distributed, and again in ways which replicate those old maps that I began with. And the best on offer in international law and institutions so far has basically been growth or business as usual plus techno-optimism, or if we think about geoengineering, sometimes even growth plus techno-dystopia. But this conjunction of contradictions also affects the North. Remember Rittich's words, we are all developing countries now. Or as we might say tonight, empire has come home in terms of environment, race and xenophobia, finance, investment and debt, but also in terms of the ongoing practices of settlement. So as Tuck and Wong remind us, for Indigenous peoples, decolonisation is not a metaphor. So just to sum up, for those who would continue the project of decolonising international law, again, not necessarily using that name, the approach has become holistic. It's not just about a challenge to system and structure, not just a challenge to knowledge and form, but to take up the language of Indigenous jurist Christine Black, it has become a question of cosmology. So now the strategies are cosmological challenges which build on strategies of provincialising international law to point out that what is provincial is not just episteme, but cosmology. This has a lot to do with the increased audibility of Indigenous peoples in several countries who have rival systems of knowledge and of law and rival laws of encounter, and a different conception of the relationship between the human and the more than human. The second kind of strategy is redescription rather than critique, to show what is there rather than critique what has been said. To insist upon the plurality of international laws, to drive a wedge into the idea that European international law has no rivals. And along with moving from critique to redescription, it eschews a tendency to try and transcend law and find the answer in politics, for example, but to stay with it and take responsibility for what we do as jurists. So in this phase, there's an attention to the world-making function of international law, or of law, through attending to the relationship, using Shauna Dorset's words, between jurisdictional form and material life, if you like. So if we can call phase 1 a legal challenge and phase 2 an epistemological challenge, then I would call phase 3 a cosmological challenge. And just to give you 3 dots to come back to our repertoires, they can be seen as phasic, but they are also overlapping in terms of these strategies. So phase 1, we can think of as resist, remember, and reimagine, with theoretical strategies of syncretism and contributionism. Phase 2, we can see as historicisation, deconstruction, and parochialisation. Phase 3, we can see as strategies of pluralisation, redescription, and responsibility. And political and research strategies at each stage are woven together. So the point has simply been to take advantage of this political conjunction between the idea of solidarity and self-interest, to draw these insights together, to say that what we have is continuous, not discontinuous with older struggles. And that when we think about being attentive to the strategies and what happened to them, we can understand that each strategy has a value and each strategy has its own price. And I will stop there.
Many thanks, Sundhya. And on a personal level, I thank you for the image of the archives. And I think on behalf of all of us, I thank you for a lecture which enfolds, to use your words, so much richness and complexity in the description of strategy and description of the worlds that we're in and the worlds that we are making. On that note, Sundhya, I just reiterate our thanks for a wonderfully rich presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm sorry that I couldn't get to London, and I'm sorry that I can't be in the room because all I have now is our 3 faces. But thank you very much.
Thanks to all our attendees.